Welcome to Macroeconomics Primer on Interest Rates on Reserves. I will begin the presentation by giving an overview of monetary policy and money supply. Interest on reserves started when the Financial Services Regulatory Relief Act of 2006 authorized the Federal Reserve banks to pay interest on balances held by, on, or behalf of depository institutions at reserve banks, subject to regulations of the Board of Governors. The authority was advanced to October 1, 2008 by the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008. Furthermore, the interest rate paid on balances maintained to satisfy reserve balance requirements is determined by the board and is intended to eliminate effectively the implicit tax that reserve requirements use to impose on depository institutions. The interest rate paid on excess balances is also determined by the board and gives the Federal Reserve an additional tool for the conduct of monetary policy. In the big picture, the goal of monetary policy is to keep unemployment and inflation in check. And with this, the Fed controls the quantity of reserves circulating in the federal funds market using the discount rate, the reserve requirement ratio, open market operations, and, as mentioned, interest on reserves. In the absence of discount lending and interest payments on reserves, the market for money and the federal funds market look very similar. Now, I would like to give some history and background on the origins of interest on reserves and where the idea stems from. 4 decades ago, Milton Friedman recommended that central banks like the Federal Reserve pay interest to depository institutions on the reserves they are required to hold against their deposit liabilities. This proposal was intended to improve monetary policy by making it easier to hit short-term interest rate targets. However, the Fed didn't have the authority to pay this kind of interest until 2008. Famously, Milton Friedman stated that the optimal quantity of money is obtained when there is no interest rate spread between money and bonds, and this laid the foundation behind interest on reserves as a monetary policy tool to handle interest rates and money supply. Currently, due to an act of Congress in 2008, the Fed now has the power to pay interest on the reserves that banks leave on deposit at the Fed. That'll change the way the Fed manages the economy. On this slide, one can see 2 charts, both with historic information, with the first one displaying reserves of depository institutions, and the second one Fed funds target rate and interest rate on reserves, and how they have evolved historically over the past few years. Once the Fed was first authorized to pay interest on reserves, the relationship between the levels of required reserves and excess reserves. On this slide, there's a chart displaying the relationship between the federal funds rate and the discount rate. Additionally, the federal funds rate can be seen as a price floor and the discount rate a price ceiling. This is because the Fed does not want the discount rate to exceed the federal funds rate, because in that way it will be better for banks and individuals to put their money and earn a discount rate on their money instead of buying federal treasuries. And prior to 2003, the discount rate was set below the federal funds rate. This situation is called historic mode.